Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Library. My name is John Highbush, and as the Executive Director of the Reagan Presidential Foundation, I have the honor of introducing our special guest today. Before I do so, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few of our special guests here today. Please welcome Thousand Oaks Mayor Tom Glancy and his wife, Karen. I'd also like to welcome Janice Gallegly, the wife of Congressman Elton Gallegly, who does an absolutely terrific job of representing us here in Simi Valley. Finally, I would like to welcome our hostess, our leader, our inspiration, and my boss, former First Lady, Mrs. Nancy Reagan. There are a few hundred of you gathered to hear from our speaker this evening, so I know that it is no secret to you that Peggy Noonan is one of the most talented and versatile writers in America today. Her work as a prolific writer can be found everywhere. She is the author of numerous books on the New York Times bestseller list, including When Character Was King, one of the finest tributes ever written about the presidency and character of Ronald Reagan. She is also a regular columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a contributor to countless other magazines, from the Washington Post to the New York Times to Time Magazine. She's also an Emmy Award nominee for her writing for the popular TV show The West Wing, a commentator and analyst for numerous television news hours, and last but not least, one of the most famous assistants to President Reagan. If you have enjoyed Peggy's writings as I have for years, then you will also know something else about Peggy. And that is, like our former First Lady, Nancy Reagan, Peggy has lived her life with her own sense of patriotic grace. I say this because regardless of the genre that Peggy chooses, whether it be remarks for the president, a weekly column, or a television series or documentary, the essence of her writings, something evidenced in her everyday conversation as well, carries with it an elegance found in few other contemporary writers. In fact, there is an eloquence and soulfulness in Peggy's work, written and spoken, that I think borders on poetry. Poetry? Well, as close to poetry as the Wall Street Journal can get. Let's take a look back at her column from just 3 weeks ago on a topic vexing many of us in the future, many of us in the party, the future of the Republican Party. To quote Peggy, "If it is alive," referring to the party, "and it is, it will evolve as living things do. Beyond that, a thought. A great party needs give. It must be expansive and summoning. It needs to say, 'Join me.' A party that is huge, vital, and national, that is truly the expression of the views of a huge and varied nation, will, by definition, contain within it those who are more to the right, more to the left, and more to the middle. This creates a constant tension, a constant fight, but no matter. As Ronald Reagan said in China, we are a great and disputatious nation. A great party needs to inspire the young and the politically uninformed, not with bloodlust, but with ideas." I am sure I do not do her words justice, so let's just hear from the poet herself. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the incomparable Peggy Noonan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, John, for that beautiful introduction. I found it almost embarrassingly flattering, but that's because I wrote it. I did not. I should note I did not. I am thrilled to meet John, as I did earlier today, as he begins his new leadership here, giving, I believe, his personal time and treasure to continue and advancing the understanding of a leader he loves. So I think all honor to you, John, and well done, and we all want to help you out. It's just nice to be here. It's wonderful to see Mrs. Reagan looking like a sunbeam in the front of the audience here. It is true that I did work for Mr. Reagan and also for George H.W. Bush, the elder Bush, years ago. Both of these things. I mean, this has been a great blessing for me to work for Ronald Reagan. It changed my life, all for the better. Total blessing. Now and then I sit back and think these happy thoughts. There's a story I tell. I was literally thinking, wow, what a lucky woman I am to have lived some of the moments I have lived. I was thinking this on a plane on my way into Houston just a few years ago. I was going to make a speech to some conservatives. As I said, I was on a jet. I was having a good day. I'd been bumped up to first. You know, it's one of those days, everything seems benign, life is unrolling happily before you. I think a Bloody Mary was involved with my general feeling of well-being. We were coming into Houston. It was dusk. The sunlight was hitting those tall, silver gray skyscrapers and turning them to scarlet and to gold. And I had thought, during the flight, just as we were coming in, I had thought during the flight that the stewardess was staring at me now and then, which was an odd way to feel, and it turned out when we landed at the end of the flight, I was correct. She had been staring at me, and she walked up to me. And she said, "Excuse me, but aren't you that woman who worked for Reagan and then went on to write books and articles and go on TV?" And I thought, what a way to begin a trip. And I said, "Yes, I guess I am." And she was awed, and she said, "It is such an honor to meet you, Mrs. Kirkpatrick." That really happened. I told Jean Kirkpatrick that story. She laughed. It happens, I still send notes now and then to the first President Bush. He, as some of you may know, is a great note writer. He has about 20,000 close friends, his closest friends, and I'm one of them. I told him recently, I sent him along a copy I had completed, I said this with real pride, my 8th book, called Patriotic Grace. I sent him the galleys when I got them. He wrote back right away, and he said congratulations in a very warm way. And then he said he promised he was going to read my book. And then he wrote in his little handwriting at the end, he said, "Congratulations again. I just hope your book is the great success Millie's was." Do you know the meaning of that? Millie was a dog. Millie wrote a book about 20 years ago. It came out at the same time as my first book, and it sold 10 times as many copies. But I was always very gracious about it. I'd see her now and then. I'd come down from New York to Washington to go to visit the Bushes at their White House Christmas party, and I'd always see Millie curled up in the corner, and I'd always go over and say hello to the little bitch. Mrs. Reagan is laughing. But it is to Mr. Reagan, to Ronald Reagan, that my thoughts always return. In the White House, I was thinking of this the other day when I was preparing this. In the White House, we had many names for him. We called him the boss, the chief, the oldest and wisest, or the O&W. And one of the secretaries in the speechwriting office, when the President and Nancy's helicopter used to come in and settle down on I think the north lawn of the White House is where it would settle down when the Reagans would come back from a foreign diplomatic trip. We would hear the roar of the blades as the helicopter, Marine One, came literally over our office in the old executive office building. And we would look out, and the young secretary of the fellow who ran speechwriting, her name was Donna, she'd hear the sound and she would so sweetly call out to all of us, "Daddy's home." I will always see President Reagan as the last great gentleman of American politics in terms of a great and natural grace, a lovely public dignity and warmth. He was the kind of man who spoke softly by nature, who didn't yell, didn't lose his temper, didn't want to lose his temper. He never treated people like the help, and we were the help. He treated us as if we were his equals when we were not his equals. He stood when a lady or an older person entered the room. I think this stuff is precious. I think it's the kind of old school courtesy that has graced our politics and our public life. He was the modern exemplar of this old school. And in those times, now sometimes when I do not see it, I always miss it. He set the standard. I don't think anybody has quite met his standard since. It is always an honor, I should note, to be in this great library, which I have visited before, and to be surrounded in some mysterious way that I'm trying to get my head around by the facts and artifacts of a great man's life. I am Catholic. I happen to be Catholic. And because of that, I think somewhat I pay a lot of attention to the corporality of life, to its very physicalness, to its real physical nature. And so I find it exciting and inspiring to see and touch what Ronald Reagan literally touched, literally used. If you go back in the stacks here, as I'm sure many of you who've done some research here perhaps have done, if you go back in the back rooms here, you'll find the actual short stories he wrote with his little pen as a young man in college, the cartoons he drew, the gear he used at the farm. I have a feeling, I really do not know if it is superstitious, I only know that it is not provable, but I have a feeling always that, or at least a sense that objects, physical objects, absorb and hold some of the spirit, the essence or energy of the one who used them a great deal. In the Catholic Church, in a very specific limited way, we are big on what we call relics. Relics are not old things or old-fashioned things. Relics are literally things which have been touched or used by a saint. And you know, I happen to have 2 relics. You are a lucky person to live in this modern world where you can move around enough that you actually have 2 relics that are priceless in my view, in my home. One is a pair of rosary beads given to me by a man who I think is a future saint of the Catholic Church, and that is Ronald Reagan's old friend, John Paul II. And I also have a pamphlet given to me by Mother Teresa, another future saint. Whatever things, these physical things hold of the giver, they remind me that history is real. It's not some old abstract thing back in the mists. It's real, it's palpable, it has a physical presence. And that's one of the things that I think, ironically enough, presidential libraries remind us of. They remind us this really happened. The presence, the simple humanity of the president, history is trying to capture in a place like this. It's all here. It really happened. The Mother Teresa pamphlet was given to me on one of those, I cannot help but remember it as a typically sparkling and sun-filled afternoon at the Reagan White House, when Mother Teresa, as you will remember, Nancy, was given at a formal Rose Garden ceremony given by the President, Mrs. Reagan. She was given the Medal of Freedom. I met her afterwards. She wordlessly put a pamphlet in my hand, and then she said 2 words. She said, "Love Gott." And after a moment, I realized she just said, "Love God." I have received a lot of advice in my lifetime. I don't suppose I've received any advice that was better than that advice, and to be given it by a saint. I remember Mrs. Reagan's graciousness to that diminutive woman from a foreign land, and I remember that for a moment they held hands. Mrs. Reagan did with her, I think, what she always does and became famous for doing, which is make you comfortable, make you happy in the little sphere you're in. I think there is a funny thing that happens as you get older. You actually, if you try very hard, become wiser about life. And I will tell you that Nancy Reagan, as appreciated as she is, as celebrated as she is not appreciated and celebrated enough. I'm not saying this to be polite or to be a pleasant guest. I'm saying it because it is true. The way I think of it now is this. Do you like Ronnie? Thank Nancy. Are you grateful for his presidency? Thank Nancy. Did it change the world? Well, thank you, Nancy. That's where it comes down. There was no him without her. He would not have been able to have the career he had, the joy he had, the leadership he offered, without the one person behind him he needed to have. And if she wasn't there, nothing worked, nothing was possible. She was the stable platform from which a daring, new, and historically crucial midlife career was launched. She held down the fort, encouraged him, protected him, made him smile, and made him possible. So, I think it is true that literally not enough can be said. She will never say it. So I think at this point we better. So now when I go to great symposia and speeches in Washington, D.C., and they say Reagan was great, and they ask for my 2 cents, sometimes they do, my first words now are, well, let's start with thank you, Nancy, and it brings down the house. It's a very orienting sort of comment for people. So thank you, Nancy. This is not something you need to hear, but I think it is a thing a number of us need to say. So, how you liking it so far? How am I doing? Oh, thank you very much. Goodbye. I am going to, my purpose here tonight is I want to speak very briefly on a huge topic that I can only touch on a little bit. It is the meaning of Ronald Reagan, by which I mean, of course, just a little few slivers of his meaning, and maybe in just a few areas. The philosopher and anthropologist Lawrence Vanderpost, I am a fan of him, in a memoir of his relationship with the great psychiatric pioneer Carl Jung, Lawrence Vanderpost said that we all forget the obvious. He said, quote, "We live not only our own lives, but, whether we know it or not, also the life of our time." I find that to be an arresting statement. Think of it. We add to that larger life, the life of our nation, or detract. We give or withhold. We lead or shrink back. We put ourselves on the line for the truth, or we ignore the summons. We meet the great challenge of our age, or we retreat to our gardens. It is not bad to tend your garden. It is, in fact, necessary and good. You can find wholeness, solace, and truth there. But to tend it and also step forward into history, to step into the life of your age, to step onto history's stage and seek to take part constructively, to try to make your era better. That is a very great thing. And that is what Ronald Reagan did. He stepped forward, made the world better. So, the first thing we learn about his meaning is, first lesson I suppose we learn about his meaning is, be there, do, take part, make the sacrifice, lead. We can't be told this enough. We know a few things about the meaning of Ronald Reagan through his philosophy. Now, in an odd way, or in one way, conservatives are so much luckier in having a Reagan to look back to and admire than liberals were or are in having a Franklin Roosevelt. This is what I mean. FDR did not actually much get into the meaning of liberalism, the deeper meaning or the explication of his political philosophy. He was most persuasive at speaking of his separate and discrete positions, of framing them as the first modern media president, which is what he was, of framing those decisions for his radio audiences. He was famous and celebrated, of course, in his fireside chats for explaining his immediate latest decision and doing it in a way that made big things that were complicated more understandable, more graspable. It was FDR who said of helping England, our beloved friends in England, in 1939 as World War II began, it was FDR who, in trying to rouse the American people to help England with Lend-Lease, said, look, after all, when your neighbor's house is on fire, you want to lend them your garden hose, don't you? You don't want to stand there and do commentary. The house is on fire, lend them your garden hose. Well, my goodness, that was exactly it. Everyone understood it. That was FDR. And of course, listening at home from 1932 onward was a young man, age 21 in 1932, named Dutch Reagan, who listened to FDR, who learned something of the sound and tone of the presidency, who absorbed it without trying to absorb as an artist absorbs, which, by the way, was young Ronald Reagan's self-identification. What he thought he was early on was an artist, an actor in theatricals, a short story writer, a drawer of cartoons. He saw himself early on as a writer. So, in those days, as a young man, the artist didn't know it, but as he was leaning toward the radio, he was learning at the feet of the master something about how to speak in public, how to speak to people, how to make your case, how to summon the highest selves of his listeners. So that was one of FDR's, I think, greatest contributions, not mentioned all that much, what he taught Ronald Reagan. It was a huge contribution to history from FDR. But back to the subject of political philosophy, FDR didn't really much state his political philosophy. He didn't really want to declare it or declare its logic or plumb its depths, perhaps because he perceived the philosophy would not be as popular, or quite as popular, as the acting out of the philosophy in discrete political decisions. Also, perhaps it's true that he didn't spend a lot of time thinking, FDR, about his own political philosophy. Eleanor did. Eleanor thought about it a lot and wrote about it. He didn't. He was a big-time politician. He was a practical Paul in many respects, and he was interested in power. He was in the greatness game. He wanted to run things. So liberals now can still and do celebrate FDR's decisions, leadership, presidency, but philosophy is a blanker area. With Reagan, conservatives are able to celebrate his decisions, his leadership, his presidency, but also his philosophy. He wrote of it, he spoke of it, he explained it. It was what he was all about. You well know that philosophy. Books could be written about it. Shortly, to sum it up, that philosophy included greater power and autonomy and respect for the individual and less, comparatively, for the state or the government. You don't want to let the government crowd out and make demands that are too heavy on human beings. You want to have as much government as you need, but no more than that. And you want to have the government you have do its job. And part of that job is the national defense, or a clear, strong foreign policy based on realism. You don't want more government than you need. I think it was Ronald Reagan's particular insight, being an adult operating in the world from the 1940s onwards, was to see that in the modern age, government would be more central than ever, more powerful than ever, because it would be more capable than ever to make demands. It would be more federal than ever. Washington, he could see, was going to be taking more and more power over a period of 50 years or so. And essentially that has been true. He put all of these thoughts and many more thoughts into the speech in the Reagan Library. I just saw it earlier today. You can go watch the speech from beginning to end. This, of course, is the great speech Ronald Reagan made in 1964, supporting the presidential candidacy of Barry Goldwater. God bless Barry Goldwater. He was a wonderful man, but he could not explain his presidential candidacy as well as Ronald Reagan could explain his candidacy. You could see, if you read that speech, you could see Ronald Reagan's entire coming career in it. The things he stood for were right there, and that was the beginning of his political career. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a bit, jerk ahead and then jerk back. A great question, a rolling question, which is going to be answered each day over the next few years, maybe the next few decades. It's a question that John referred to and quoted me on. It is still unanswered. It is, what is Ronald Reagan to Republicans as they remake their party? For they must remake it. During the George W. Bush era, it got broken. It splintered like a dropped pane of glass. And the conservative movement was dropped and splintered, I think, in the same way, torn apart by a whole host of issues: the war, the prosecution of the war, immigration, spending, growth of government, social issues. It is true that Ronald Reagan brought conservatism together and made it coalesce within a great political party just by showing up. He was a magnet. Everybody else was a little medal filing. He came forward, the medal filings came towards him. But where to go now in 2009? Where to be? There's a great debate here, can't cover the whole thing. I think that it is obvious that the questions that face us as a nation The questions that face us as a movement, as a Republican Party, can only be illuminated, clarified, made clearer by holding realistically to Reagan-esque principles. They are a beginning point. We must apply them as best we can. We must apply, I think, enduring Reaganism, and it is enduring, and try to take it and apply it to the 21st century. That can be tricky, I think. But I start here. Reaganism is realism. That's where I start. We all agree, and must agree, I think, on Reagan-esque principles regarding a first-rate, peerless, unsurpassed national defense. That's an easy one. But what about a strong, credible, clear foreign policy? I happen to think here there's been a little misunderstanding of President Reagan, especially among the young who are always full of beans and always thinking sort of in an exciting and dramatic fashion. But there are times when the young look at Reaganism, and sometimes the not-so-young look at Reaganism and say, oh, good, that was happily aggressive, and that really put the ball forward, and that was kind of punching forward. Reagan loved peace. He loved pushing the ball forward as far as he could push it, and he loved peace. He had no illusions about war. He'd been in the armed services during a war. He didn't like war. We must not forget the Reagan-esque respect for the reality of the world, rooted in Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk, and a Reagan-esque desire for peace. Reagan thought if you fight, if you have to fight, then you win. That's it. If an American president commits American troops, you go in there. Big, massive, and win, end of story. But are you eager to commit American troops? Of course not, because war is hell, and all grown-ups knew it. All grown-ups know it. War is actually worse than hell. I think it's a charnel house in hell. His way, Ronald Reagan's way, was to think, to look, say it's the Soviet Union, the great challenger of his time, and to think and say, the Soviet Union is involved in wickedness. It is itself at war with the very nature of man. We will speak the truth to it and about it. We will have a revolution of candor. They were an empire subjugating Eastern Europe. They were evil in many of their actions. They were a brute atheist nation. And we forget now, 50, 60, 70 years later, we forget so much of American resistance to Sovietism, if you will, from the beginning of the Russian Revolution, was that it was aggressively atheistic. Do you remember that? I think people actually forget it as a major item. America, as a believing nation, would never love such a governmental system, would always be skeptical about it, would always defend against it, understanding that its very atheism removed the underpinnings of moral thought, and as such was a challenge to the world just by definition. An atheist dictatorship with nuclear weapons whose premier had said, "We will bury you." Holy mackerel. Ronald Reagan wasn't going to be intimidated by that. He was going to tell the truth about it. He was going to thwart its aggressions diplomatically, do the best we could. He was going to press at their vulnerable points, outspend them, outthink them, outspy them. He was going to wait them out. He was going to reach out. And we know from his beautiful, heartfelt, deep letters to Brezhnev and to Gorbachev, which are here at the library, this was a man who wanted peace and friendship. He really did. And he wasn't afraid to put out his hand the first time and the second time, even when somebody didn't put a hand back. He was anxious about the terrible weapons of the age in which he lived and in which we live. That's what SDI was about, make people safer. This man was a lifeguard as his first job. He liked guarding life. He liked keeping people alive. But of course, he wasn't crazy. He wasn't going to invade the Soviet Union. He wasn't going to invade Eastern Bloc nations, even though some of the people there would have been happy if he had. He would never be reckless. He would never be vulnerable to the charge of aggression or imperialism or having ambitions that should not be had by a great democratic nation. He was going to do everything he could. And in circumstances where he had to, under provocation, a Libya, a Grenada, well then, Katie, bar the door. America was going to go in quick and hard and do what was right and come back home. So I always think Reagan, don't misunderstand him, he was a peace lover. He did not have a babyish sense of American invincibility. He did not think you could overextend or exhaust our military. He did not want to stretch too thin the sympathy of an anxious world. Wanted to play within reality. He and his great friend and colleague, Margaret Thatcher, his boon companion, they were boon companions in this, and it worked well. They lived in the possible. They lived in the possible, in the imperfect, in the broken, knowing that nothing perfect could be made by the crooked timber of man or the twisted timber of politics. So I always think of President Reagan, he had the peaceableness of a warrior. If you know any great warriors, there's a certain part of them that is deeply peaceable. He was. So he appreciated the facts of his era. He accepted what had to be accepted. He was never passive. Tried to persuade. He never abandoned principles. He spoke and led within the possible. And so I say Reaganism is realism. Lincoln once said public opinion is everything. What he meant was there were many good things he wanted to do and he thought were right, but he had to wait sometimes for the public to catch up with him. In the meantime, he spoke, he urged, he persuaded. Reagan was Lincoln-esque in this way. I think the first thing a grown-up does when the grown-up is leading is admit what is true, move within it, act within it, figure the most conservative stance within reality, make the case again and again and again to change minds and to guide them in a certain direction. So, this is how I see it. America says it wants health care, a new health care system. It's been talking about this for years, going up higher, higher, higher in the polls. My thought is, if you're in politics, you recognize reality, recognize the hunger for change, and you attempt to fashion a system based on Reagan-esque principles of freedom and competition and patient autonomy and patient authority. It is important to stand where you stand and stand with your principles, but it's also important to know what time it is. It's a delicate thing. You have to be a gifted person or an artist when you're a political leader to balance what time it is versus what it is you want and to hold on to your principles. It is so important, I think, for conservatives now. This is an important part of my message, I guess, my message. Do not withdraw into a cocoon insisting on purism, as in, we believe only in purity, and if the people aren't with us, then the people are wrong, and to the hell with them. That was not Reagan's way. Another area I want to quickly touch on because it's important. In what I saw at the Revolution, I called a chapter, Come Walk With Me. It was about Ronald Reagan campaigning in the 1984 campaign. One of the wonderful things about Reagan is how he held out his hand to all sorts of people who might join the Republican Party. He wasn't narrow, he wasn't old-fashioned, he wasn't constricted. He wanted everyone in whatever their past or thoughts or class or background. He was a former Democrat. He said in the 1984 campaign, he literally put out his hand sometimes when he was making his stump speech, and he'd say, "Come walk with me." In this way, he invited the American people in, all of them. He didn't just hold together his coalition, he expanded his coalition. He went for those who came to be called Reagan Democrats. Do you know what Reagan Democrats were called before Ronald Reagan? They were called Democrats. It was Reagan who made them Reagan Democrats, who made them want to join his team. I think the Republican Party, before he started to transform it, really, in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Republican Party had a reputation as a certain constricted, more narrow, slightly more country clubbish sort of thing. One of the things I fear now is that the conservative movement right now is going to reenact what the Republican Party seemed like in the 1940s and 50s and be a little bit narrow or judging or constricting, or a little bit, you must, to be part of our group, hold all of our views. And if you do not hold all of our views, you are not welcome here. I call this the conservatism of the comment thread. Some of you, a number of you, go to the internet at least once a day for news, for information, for political views, for all that stuff. And you go on Google and you go on Drudge and you may go on the Huffington Post, but you got a lot of sites you go to. And you will see a news story or a column or somebody's blog post about a political figure, and then you will go at the end to see comments. That's where the comment thread is. That's where people can write in anonymously under nicknames they've chosen to give their viewpoint on whatever's being said in the story or whatever political person is being talked about. These comments, and I urge you, find yourself a nice little political story about Governor Schwarzenegger and go to the comment thread. Holy mackerel. Holy mackerel, it's meaner than snakes in there on the comment thread. There's attacking, there is crazy rage, there is "you're not our type, buddy, get out of here." They damn Democrats and others with more vigor than sense. There is a certain air of teamism. You have to be on the conservative team now. There's an air of teamism that is starting to look like gangism. It worries me. It's not good. I believe the conservative movement has to go back to the old expansiveness and variety and easygoingness, kind of rock and easygoingness of Ronald Reagan. And I do think some people have this backwards. There are some who think that it is Reagan-esque to think my way or the highway. If you don't see it our way, get lost. We anathematize you, you're gone. My goodness, Ronald Reagan was, among other things, a practical politician. He wasn't there to lose. He was there to win and push the ball forward. He knew, of all people, politics is a game of addition, not subtraction. Ronald Reagan didn't throw anybody out. He couldn't shake a fist in your face because his hand was too busy welcoming you. So I think conservatism must return to its Reagan-esque expansiveness and eager welcoming. And Reagan, anyway, was the last who would anathematize anyone. I often remember, it became a story for a few days in the 1976 or the 1980 election, presidential election, I can't remember which. The local Southern California John Birch Society came out in support of Ronald Reagan, and the press, of course, went crazy. They said, "Mr. Reagan, Governor Reagan, this controversial group is supporting you. What's your reaction? Aren't you embarrassed?" And Reagan very coolly said, "Oh, that's so nice. They're supporting me." That's what they said, right? I didn't say I'm supporting them. And he breezed on, and that was the end of the story. That was not a bad way to operate. He didn't judge them. He didn't beat them up. He didn't distance himself from them. He just said, oh, they're supporting me. How very wonderful. So, I'm going to close with this. We keep talking about the Republican Party as a big tent party. Well, baby, I am a big tent person, but when I think of this, I think of polls. It's polls, half a dozen, 8, 10, or 12 polls that literally hold up a tent. Without them, the tent collapses. Without good, strong tent poles, you got just a bunch of collapsed material. A big collapsed canvas. My thought is conservatives and Republicans should pick out their poles. You should find a pole that they are comfortable standing under and get on under that tent. One pole might be the opportunity pole. There might be a low taxes pole, the low regulation pole, the respect and affection for the settled arrangements and traditions of man pole. You can have a whole bunch of poles that go together but aren't the same pole. Invite everyone in. Say you may not like the pole I like best, but you can go find your own pole. Get a lot of people, make the tent bigger, keep those poles strong. Then it will make its mark, that tent, against the landscape. Then you will see the people in it and take them into account. Then they will vote, and then they will win. So those are my thoughts. A conservatism, this is what I want, a conservatism that lives in the world, is at home in the world, has principles, holds them high, understands what they are. That is a tent I'd fit into, you would fit into. And when you meet someone, when you meet someone who's open to conservatism, hold out your hand. Say, come walk with me. That's what Ronald Reagan would do, like the happy warrior he was. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Can we do some Q&A? Oh, sure.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was just absolutely terrific. She has time for just a couple of questions. If you have one, we have a few staff around the room that have microphones. If you could wait till they get the microphone to you, and if you could raise your hand very high so they can see you. I see one right over here.
First of all, I have to apologize. I want to say something to Mrs. Reagan. I've never been in a room with her before. And Mrs. Reagan, I was in college when your husband was president. My car was red, so I named it in your honor. I wore a red tie in your honor. And I want to say thank you for making him great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Miss Noonan, you may know me as the blogger who compared you to the goddess Athena.
Now that's a good blogger and a good comment thread.
Some of our comment threads are like snakes, I have to say.
Oh my goodness.
My question to you is related to the goddess Athena. As you may know, she served as mentor to a number of the Greek heroes. And what strikes me about your writing is how well you were able to write in Ronald Reagan's voice in the 1980s. And then now you write in your own unique voice. And so I was wondering, which mentors helped you to find both the ability to write for a great president and to write a great column?
Two answers. I thank you very much for that gracious question. I've never been compared to the goddess Athena. Thank you. Just thank you. Two things. Ronald Reagan was the easiest president in the world to write for. Two reasons. One is that he had his own distinct style. Before I worked for Ronald Reagan, I worked as a writer at CBS News. Part of my job was to listen to Ronald Reagan's speeches and cut them up into usable bits that we could put on the news. So much of my life for a few years was listening to President Ronald Reagan. So his sound just came into my head, all right? The second thing was much more profound. You can work for a president. As somebody who worked for Jimmy Carter told me once, he said, Peggy, you were so lucky you worked for Ronald Reagan. I said, why? He said, because Ronald Reagan knew what he thought and why he thought it, and you knew what he thought and why he thought it. He said, I worked for Jimmy Carter. We didn't know what he thought and why he thought it. I can't, it had never been pointed out to me that simply before, but it was actually true. Again, Reagan had a philosophy, he had views. If you worked for Reagan, you could imagine with clarity where he would stand on something, and you could imagine how he would put it, because he was Reagan. He wasn't nebulous and formless. He was Reagan. Formed. All you had to do was jump into his tailstream. The jet was going by. Do you know what I mean? Second thing, a matter of real luck to me, real part of the wonderful good fortune of my life. I went to work at CBS News in New York in late 77. Late 1977, I was a kid. 12. Guess what? Guess who taught you? I was on the radio side of CBS News. Guess who taught you, who edited your work as you wrote for radio side and wrote national reports at CBS News? Can anyone guess? No, not Dan Rather. He was still a young guy. It was the Murrow boys. Can you imagine this? The guys who had been taught to write for Words in the Air by Edward R. Murrow, who invented modern media, the sound of the modern media news broadcast. He invented it. The guys he taught, Richard C. Hodelet, Douglas Edwards, Dallas Townsend, their careers had reached their heights, and now they were fellows on radio side. I was a kid coming up, learning how to write for radio, and they were the guys I wrote for. They corrected how I wrote. They'd say, Peggy, you can't do a sentence that is 15 lines long. You can do that in a newspaper and have fun with it, but people are hearing this only once. It's going by in the car. You got to be clear. They taught me everything. I didn't even fully know it, but some little part of me thought, I'd say to them, so how did you start here? And they'd go, well, Ed Murrow hired me in '38. Wow. I mean, at least I had the wit to realize, okay, Ed Murrow taught you and you're teaching me? All righty then, So that's a long answer to a short question. But thank you again for Athena, and I'm going to write that down in my notes tonight. Can we do any more?
Yes, we have time for one more question.
Oh, yes, sir.
Right here.
I'll tell you, on foreign affairs, I see two Obamas. On foreign affairs, I see, say in terms of foreign policy, I am not alarmed. Many conservatives are, but so far I am not. I think so far so good. He's trying to set a new tone. He's trying to make new friends. I like outreach. I like diplomacy. He's giving a speech to the Muslim world in Egypt. Great. This is a new air of moderation that I find very attractive. It allows the world to hit reset. There's something else Obama does that I think is profoundly important, and I've felt this very strongly in the past year. I think we're in for a heck of a struggle with the Islamic world and with terrorism, and it's not over. It's going to go for a while. There are two ways to look at that struggle, and for the world to look at that struggle. One is, that's a Republican story. It's a George W. Bush and Dick Cheney story. It's all about them. Another way is, let's share power. Republicans sometimes, Democrats sometimes. Let both American parties own the struggle. Let both of the American parties take authority, have responsibility, know leadership. I like it that Obama's doing that. That's foreign affairs. Economics, holy mackerel. Holy mackerel. Shortly, briefly, I do think that the U.S. government probably had to, because so many son of a gun, irresponsible people in huge positions were irresponsible in the past decade. I believe the U.S. government had to pump plenty of money in the system after last September 15th to keep it up. I just go with that. I know something about the psychology of markets and the psychology of people and the way the economy works. Flood the zone sometimes. That's good. What's terrible? The sheer size of things, so that now we're talking about trillions, and people think trillion means billion, and they think billion means million. Do you know what I mean? They've sort of lost track of the size of things. And the president is not only focusing on the economy domestically, but deciding to go forward and meet a number of his campaign pledges with regard to energy and health care and this and that. My feeling is, excuse me, when you were running for president the past 10 years, we weren't in an emergency. You don't have to come through and gluck up everything with all of these programs and new ways to spend money. I don't think it's responsible. I think President Obama is doing it deliberately. I think there's going to be a lot of political payoff in it. I have a feeling he's going to be very popular at least for a while, maybe at least until the bill starts coming due. But economically and domestically, I'm not digging them. Foreign affairs, okay, that's where I am.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. If I could just ask for your patience, if you could just give Mrs. Reagan and her guest a moment to exit. We'll be off on our way this evening. Thank you again.
Thank you.